nerds, what's up? Today I'm going to talk about my favorite and least favorite book to movie adaptations. See you after the jump. Okay, we all know book is best, but there are some films that really do justice to the fantasy books they come from, and there are others that are just horrible. So today I'm going to talk about my top 5 of each, my top 5 favorite book to movie adaptations and my top 5 least favorite fantasy book to movie adaptations. Let's jump into the list. So we're going to start with the positive and go with my top 5 favorite book to movie adaptations for fantasy novels. Starting off with number 5, The Hunger Games. I think they absolutely nailed The Hunger Games, especially with the casting. Jennifer Lawrence as Katniss did such an excellent job, and of course Elizabeth Banks as Effie. I felt like they really just got the emotion and the atmosphere of The Hunger Games. Now, I know some of the main complaints were that they took out some pretty important parts of the book, like, for example, Peeta didn't lose a leg, which I think was kind of weird. I think they should have. I'm not sure why they didn't do that. And I know the end of the games when the dogs are supposed to be kind of like the contestants and they just made them regular dogs. Although I do think that's a weaker part of the movie because dogs don't seem very scary for the end of the games. I actually agree with them not making them like the contestants. I think that would have been extremely cheesy. I cannot think of a way that they could have made that work and make sense in a movie atmosphere without much explaining. What I think they just nailed, despite those few changes, is just the feelings. They played so well with music and silence. I remember in the movie I'd get chills sometimes during the violent scenes when everything would just go silent, and it really brought to light what was going on in the games. I also weirdly think that the I volunteer moment is actually more emotional in the movie, not because it's any better than the book, but the way that the actors were able to portray the emotion of that scene was so excellent. The music, the cinematography, I really applaud them for that effort. You really feel what you think Katniss is feeling. So overall, I just really love The Hunger Games, and I think they did an excellent job on that first movie. Number 4, Holes. Okay, so I know Holes isn't exactly fantasy. It's kind of like fantasy adjacent, but I just loved this book so much as a kid, and I'm obsessed with their movie adaptation. They pretty much did every single event from the book. I think it's one of the only movies I know where they literally took everything from the book and just adapted it to the movie pretty much. And Dule Hill as Sam just nails it. I don't know why his performance of all of them stood out so much to me, but he really just brought that character to life and brought this like sweetness to that movie. And I think they did such a good job with it. They didn't change very much. I think the only thing they really changed was Stanley's weight. In the book, he originally kind of starts out bigger and loses weight through all of the hard labor he does. And I remember seeing a behind the scenes years and years ago that they talked about how it would be kind of inappropriate for a child actor to be put through that. And I think that was actually pretty respectable, and I don't think it really took away from the story very much at all. And of course, the soundtrack was seriously so bomb. I still listen to it to this day. I don't even know how long that movie came out, like 20 years ago. But it is so good. So I just love Holes, and I always think that stands out to me as a great book to movie adaptation. Number 3, The Princess Bride. So I grew up loving The Princess Bride as a kid. I watched it all the time with my family and my family friends. My sister and I used to quote it all the time. And interestingly enough, I actually didn't read the book till much later in life when I was an adult, like only 4 or 5 years ago maybe I read it. And just let me tell you, if you grew up watching The Princess Bride like I did and you haven't read the book, you need to read the book. It is such a treat. But that being said, the movie is an incredible adaptation of the book. The book is actually pretty long, so they definitely take things out of the book and they change some things of the book, but they totally keep the atmosphere. The book is hilarious, and they really bring that to the movie as well. If possible, the book is actually even funnier, but I think they did a great job on the movie. Like, the things they had to change and take out make sense for the movie, and the movie stands on its own. Of course, the casting was incredible. I mean, so many of those lines are so famous. Like, they stand this test of time because of the people who are delivering them, and I think it was a great job. I also understand why they changed the framing of the story to be a kid and his grandpa. I think it'd be too hard to bring to life the framing of the original story, but I have to say the framing of the original story is genius and tricks a lot of people, including me. I was a little confused at first. So if you haven't read it, don't look into it. Just kind of read it on its own. But I do understand why they changed that, and I think it was successful the way they did. Overall, I love The Princess Bride, and they really nailed what to leave in and what to take out to make both the book and movie stand on their own as quality pieces of work. Number 2, Good Omens. Okay, so this is a really recent one actually that just catapulted to the top of my list. And maybe it's cheating a little bit because it's a show, so they had a little bit more time. to process things in the book, but I also feel like there's a good argument to be made that like the people making this knew that it needed to be a show and not a movie. Like that's a good decision to be made, and it worked really well for Good Omens. Again, this was another one where the casting was just nailed. Like Aziraphale and Crowley, just perfect. They brought the characters to life. In fact, it's one of those few adaptations where when I go back and read the book, I can't get the casting out of my head, which rarely happens for me. I don't usually like casting enough to feel that way. But in this case, it was so dead on, like I can't get the way they looked out of my head. And they changed very little. Like pretty much everything from the book is in there, which is great. The only things they changed around were like some genders and races, which I think were very positive changes. I think just like a little bit more diversity can never be a bad thing. So I appreciated that they did that. But overall, if you haven't read the book or haven't seen the adaptation, I highly recommend it. It's very good. In fact, I talk about it in my Good Omens review because I liked it so much. And finally, my number one pick for best fantasy book to movie adaptation. Can you guess what it is? It's The Lord of the Rings. Okay, so technically this is a trilogy, but I don't care. I'm counting it. Lord of the Rings just nails it. I think a lot of people agree with that. The movies were incredible. They started a second revolution for Lord of the Rings, and I think it has to do with a lot of reasoning. Again, casting. Casting was super on point. I feel like there's very few weak links in that casting. They really, like, the decisions on what they decided to keep in and leave out were very masterful. Now, if you watch my video about Lord of the Rings, you'll know that I really love a lot of the things they left out, particularly the ending with the Shire, maybe Tom Bombadil. But I think those decisions were the right decisions. They couldn't keep everything in. The movies would have been too long. They would have been too bloated. So they had to make the decisions, and I think they actually made the right ones, which is really hard to do. And I think that is a very key element when we're having a good book-to-movie adaptation. What can you take out and not lose the feel of the book? Interestingly enough, this one also has the opposite, which I usually rarely like, but it adds things in that aren't in the book, but it is with the intent to keep the atmosphere and feeling of the book. So I think the biggest example obviously is the Eye of Sauron. If you've read the book, this Eye of Sauron on that big tower, it does not exist in the book. That is a pure movie fabrication. It comes from the idea that Sauron is always described as seeing everything, having his eye on everything, but he's a person in the novels, if I remember correctly, right? He's a person, he's not like this amorphous eye. But that imagery is so tied to Lord of the Rings now. That's how you know it's successful, because it has become synonymous, even though it's not even in the novels. I think it was smart. You kind of needed that big bad imagery to really get the feeling of the evil in that novel as it's described. Overall, I'm just always blown away when I read the novels and see the movies that they took on such an epic thing and did such an excellent job. It will probably always be my number one. I think it'll be really hard to unseat. Okay, I have an honorable mention, and it is Jurassic Park. I think Jurassic Park, the book and the movie, are both great. They're different in a lot of ways, but I think it's one of those cases where they're both different but both good on their own. So I had to mention it as my kind of honorable mention. You'll notice that in the top 5, there's a lot of similarities. It's usually that they stuck pretty true to the source material and they had excellent casting. I think those two things are really kind of the meat of what you need. Additionally, interestingly enough, 3 out of my 5 had the original authors very, very involved with the screenplay. So I think that can also be a benefit if they're very involved and kind of can say like, no, that ruins the book, or this is what we need to keep in. Okay, without further ado, now we're gonna go to the bad ones. The ones I can't stand, the ones that make me angry to think about. It's my top 5 least favorite book to movie adaptations. Number 5, The Hobbit. Bet you didn't see that coming. Lord of the Rings was my number 1 best adaptation, and The Hobbit is my 5th worst adaptation. The Hobbit is just so bloated. It makes me so angry when I think of how good it could have been. The casting was amazing, especially for Bilbo. I loved that choice, and I think it could have been so great, but they had to go and make it 3 movies. How do you have The Hobbit, which is shorter than any one of the single Lord of the Rings novels, and make it into 3 movies when the Lord of the Rings as 3 novels was 3 movies? It doesn't make any sense. It was just such an obvious cash grab, and it makes me so angry thinking about it. I know some people like the stuff they added. No, I didn't need it. The Hobbit is perfection as it is, and you don't need to mess with it, and you don't need to make it so dang long. It just bothers me, and I'm just bummed, and I wish we could have a redo. Number 4, Ender's Game. Now, like The Hobbit, this one I guess isn't like so awful. There were good things about it. I just feel like it totally missed the feel of the novel. When I watched it, it just evoked none of those emotions that the original novel emoted in me. And I think part of that is that it's such a character-driven novel. One of my favorite parts about the novel is being in Ender's head, understanding and thinking how he thinks. And because of the way the movie was done, like, you don't get any of that. And so much of the heart of the book was lost. It became just like a general fighting sci-fi book, which isn't what's interesting about Ender's Game. I also hate that they added this weird kind of like mini romance between Ender and Petra. It wasn't in the book. It wasn't necessary. I do not understand why they thought they needed to add that. It makes no sense. I think you also lose a lot not realizing that Ender is 6 when he enters the battle school. I understand. I remember reading something from the director or somebody at the time that said that they didn't think it was possible to make Ender grow up because you wouldn't be able to get attached to his character, which I understand, but I think they could have been a little bit more creative, maybe starting him at 6 and then doing like a montage and then sticking with him at a certain age. There's just when you change it from 6 to 12, I think was the movie, a lot of it is lost. Like, part of the shock factor is that these kids are 6 years old when they're doing this. And so, I don't know. It just was a huge disappointment. And I'm not surprised it didn't do very well because it just didn't capture any of the heart of the original book. Number 3, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Look, like most people my age, I am a die-hard Harry Potter fan. I don't care how stated that is. I don't care how many people are. I am it, and it's fine. And so I actually have a trouble with a lot of the movies. I'm such a die-hard book fan that I get annoyed at even the slightest things that are different, and it's kind of hard for me to watch them a lot of the times. But for the most part, the movies are passable. They're fine. But The Goblet of Fire is just such a travesty. I actually have not seen it since it was in the theater. I hated it that much. There are so many things wrong with this movie, but I will touch on the bigger grievances I have with it. The first one being Mad-Eye Moody. How did Mad-Eye Moody go from a character who was supposed to be terrifying to this silly, over-exaggerated joke of a person? It just totally changed the mood of the whole movie, and it was such a bizarre choice. I don't know how J.K. Rowling let them do that. It didn't make any sense. The other gripe I have is I just think if you hadn't read the book, you'd have no idea what was going on in this movie. It was such like a complicated plot at the end to kind of find out why Crouch had done all of this and who was who. And I remember thinking it was like a 30-second scene at the end. Like, all of a sudden you see the doctor and it's like, oh, it was really Crouch the whole time and then gone. And you're like, what? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, that was my favorite part of the 4th novel, is all of that kind of like intrigue that you find out, and it's just blown off like right away. And on a lesser note, I hated the dragon chase scene. It just always bothered me that they had to make it this like weird chase around the castle. Like, I get they're trying to make it more exciting for screen, but it just seemed stupid and such a disappointment. Number 2, Ella Enchanted. Look, another one, like, if you were a girl my age growing up, you probably were obsessed with Gail Carson Levine. My sister and I loved Ella Enchanted and the Two Princes of Bar-Mare. And in fact, my Ella Enchanted copy is completely falling apart because I read it so often. And so I was so excited when a movie adaptation was coming out, and of course it was such a huge disappointment. This movie was so bizarre because it just didn't follow any of the plot. It literally took the one thing of like, Ella can't be disobedient, and then it just completely changed the movie, but some of the characters' names were the same. It was just like, everything about it was so dumb. Like, I haven't seen it since it came out, so I went and tried to remind myself of what had happened, because all I remembered was the feelings that I had. And I read through the plot synopsis. I was like, oh yeah, this was so dumb. Like, why did they change all of this stuff? And the ending scene where she like looks in the mirror, like, what? It doesn't make any sense. And it ruins like one of my favorite parts of the novel when she overcomes it herself and she says no. And she like runs out to the street and is like, no, I won't marry you. I don't know. I'm being dramatic, but it was such a good part of the book. And it just, it got ruined so much. And it's such a bummer. I wish, like, this is the kind of movie that makes me wish they had different designations. Like, instead of saying based on the movie Ella Enchanted, they could say something like using an idea from the book Ella Enchanted. So then you could set your expectations that this is not an adaptation, but rather just like we wanted to steal a single idea and make our own movie. Number 1, Eragon. I think I said that wrong. I've always said Eragon. I think it's actually Eragon, but we're just going to go with the way I feel like saying it. Honestly, I bet Ella Enchanted was kind of worse than this one. This one at least tried to follow the plot of it, but I just remember the feelings of disappointment when I was 16 sitting in that theater about them just like butchering the feeling of that novel. I really loved that novel by Paolini, I think it was. He really inspired me. He was 15 when he wrote the novel, and I remember thought like, oh, I'm going to be an author, and I like wrote because of that. It was just like such a cool book. I really enjoyed the characters and it's kind of like a good start into high fantasy for kids because it's just like a longer novel than most books like that are for that age group. And I was so excited to see the movies, and it was just like, they got the characters all wrong. They got the motivations all wrong, and the fight scenes were all overblown, and the relationships weren't the same. And I remember being so disappointed. And like, even though some of these other movies are probably worse, the feeling of disappointment, I think this was one of the first movies I saw book to movie adaptation that taught me what to expect when I see book to movie adaptations. So I think for that reason, this one always takes my top spot as the biggest disappointment. Okay, I do have a honorable mention for the top 5 worst book to movie adaptations. This was honestly going to be my number 1, except for one little reason that I couldn't do it, which is that I've actually never seen the movie. So my honorable mention is Artemis Fowl. Okay, I was obsessed with Artemis Fowl growing up. I loved the first 4 books so much. I think I read the 5th one and I wasn't a huge fan, so I know there's more, but I grew up just like obsessed with the first 4. And I had been waiting for years and years and years. Like, why haven't they made an Artemis Fowl movie? They've done like all of these other movies. Artemis Fowl, it's waiting, it's right there, right for the picking. And there's always been rumors, like I think for years. I feel like when I was a kid, there were rumors. So finally this year, my husband is like, Hillary, there's an Artemis Fowl trailer out. And I got so excited. And then I went and watched the trailer. So yes, I haven't seen this movie, but the trailer was such a travesty that this almost made my number 1. But I feel like on the technicality that I haven't seen it, I can't say that. The trailer. How did we go from boy evil genius to Spy Kids to Holly Short saying, we're your friends from the other side? Like, no, he kidnapped you, girl. What are you saying? I just can't believe they made me wait this many years and they did that to me. Anyway, what do you think of my 2 lists? I want you to know if there's any from my top list that actually make your worst list, or any from my worst list that make your top list. I want you to tell me if I'm crazy, if you really like one of those books or movies, or which ones aren't on any of my lists that you think deserve to be there. So let me know in the comments. I really want to hear about it. And if you like this video, please comment, like, and subscribe. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can follow me on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. See you next time. Bye.